in the year 135 CE, the Roman Emperor Hadrian did something that no conqueror before him had thought to do quite so deliberately. He tried to erase a people by erasing their name from the map. The province that Rome had called Judea, the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, was officially renamed Syria Palaestina, a designation drawn from the Philistines, a coastal people who had largely disappeared from history centuries earlier. And the question that historians have wrestled with ever since is this: was Hadrian's act of renaming simply administrative convenience, or was it the most calculated act of cultural genocide the ancient world had ever seen? And did it ultimately succeed? To understand what Hadrian did, you have to understand what came before him. You have to go back to a world that was already fracturing, already burning, already in the process of being dismantled piece by piece. Because the story of how Judea became Palestine is not a story that begins with a single emperor's decree. It begins with centuries of pressure, revolt, and a small people's extraordinary refusal to disappear, a refusal that paradoxically made Rome angrier and angrier until the empire did something it almost never did. It tried to unmake a nation, not just militarily, but symbolically, linguistically, and spiritually. The first act of this drama opens in Jerusalem in the year 66 CE, when a group of Jewish rebels called the Sicarii and the Zealots decided that Roman occupation had become intolerable. The immediate trigger was a combination of financial extortion by the Roman procurator Gessius Florus, who had seized 17 talents from the temple treasury, and a series of violent clashes in Caesarea between Jewish and Greek communities. But the tensions had been building for decades. Roman governors had repeatedly insulted Jewish religious sensibilities, bringing military standards bearing the image of the emperor into Jerusalem, minting coins with pagan symbols, treating the temple not as a sacred institution but as a political lever. When the revolt finally ignited in 66 CE, it spread with the speed and heat of a fire in dry grass. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem was overwhelmed. A Roman relief force under Cestius Gallus was ambushed and routed at the Battle of Beth Horon, losing nearly 6,000 soldiers and, humiliatingly, the eagle standard of the 12th Legion. Rome had not suffered an embarrassment like this in decades. And here's where the story gets complicated in a way that most people don't expect, because the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 CE was not a unified national uprising. It was fractured, internally violent, and consumed by ideological conflict almost as much as by Roman opposition. Inside Jerusalem, different factions, the Zealots, the Sicarii, the followers of John of Gishala, the forces of Simon Bar Giora, fought each other in the streets while the Roman legions under Vespasian, and then his son Titus, methodically reduced the surrounding countryside. Josephus, the Jewish historian who had himself commanded rebel forces in Galilee before surrendering to the Romans and later writing the definitive account of the war, described the internal fighting in Jerusalem as more destructive than the Roman siege itself. Granaries were burned. Food supplies were destroyed by competing factions. People starved in the streets of a city that was simultaneously being strangled from outside and torn apart from within. If you find yourself gripped by this story, by the idea that the history most people think they know is actually far stranger and more human than the textbooks suggest, then this channel is built for you. We dig into the documented record, the primary sources, the archaeology, and the contested scholarship to find what really happened in Jewish history. Subscribing means joining a community of people who refuse to accept the simplified version. Titus brought 4 legions, the 5th, 10th, 12th, and 15th, to the walls of Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE. The siege lasted approximately 5 months. The city fell in August, on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Avar, a date that Jewish tradition had already associated with catastrophe. The destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE had also occurred, according to rabbinic reckoning, on this same day. Whether this calendrical alignment was historical coincidence or later theological interpretation, sources differ, but the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was catastrophically real. The Temple Mount was razed, the menorah, the table of the showbread, and the silver trumpets were carried off to Rome, their images immortalized on the Arch of Titus that still stands in the Roman Forum today. Josephus estimated that over 1 million people died in the siege and its aftermath, though modern historians consider this figure significantly exaggerated. The actual death toll was likely in the hundreds of thousands, still a staggering number for an ancient city. Tens of thousands more were enslaved and transported across the empire. But here is the twist that changes everything. Rome thought it was finished, the temple was gone, the leadership was dead or scattered, the Sanhedrin had ceased to function as a political body. The annual half-shekel temple tax that Jews throughout the diaspora had sent to Jerusalem was now redirected by Rome to the Fiscus Judaicus, a special treasury that required Jews across the empire to pay 2 denarii annually simply for being Jewish. This was not just financial extraction, it was public humiliation. It was Rome saying, your God's house is ash, and now you pay tribute to Jupiter instead. And yet, within a generation, something happened that Rome had not anticipated. A rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who according to tradition had escaped Jerusalem during the siege, hidden in a coffin. The story is almost certainly legendary in its details, but the historical core is accepted, had established an academy at Yavne, a small town on the coastal plain. At Yavne, he and his colleagues began the extraordinary project of rebuilding Jewish religious and intellectual life, not around the temple, not around sacrifice, not around a physical center, but around the text, around Torah study, around prayer as a substitute for sacrifice, around the portable, indestructible architecture of law and interpretation. This was not merely a religious innovation, it was a survival strategy of breathtaking sophistication. The rabbis at Yavne were engineering a form of Jewish identity that could exist anywhere, under any political system, without a homeland, without a temple, without a king. They were building, in essence, a civilization designed to survive exile. This is where the story takes a turn that most people miss entirely, because Rome's destruction of the temple did not destroy Judaism. It transformed it. And that transformation would have consequences that Rome could not have predicted and would, within 60 years, provoke a second, even more catastrophic confrontation. The second revolt, the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 135 CE, is less well known than the Great Revolt of 66 to 73, but in some ways it was more significant in terms of its long-term consequences. Simon Bar Kokhba, whose real name may have been Simon ben Kokhba, led a rebellion against Hadrian that began partly in response to Hadrian's plan to build a new Roman city called Aelia Capitolina on the ruins of Jerusalem, with a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple. Some sources also point to a possible ban on circumcision as a triggering factor, though the exact sequence of cause and effect is debated among historians. What is not debated is the scale of the revolt. Bar Kokhba controlled large portions of Judea for nearly 3 years. He issued his own coins, stamped with the image of the temple and the legend, Year One of the Redemption of Israel. He was hailed by the great Rabbi Akiva as the Messiah, a designation that other rabbis disputed even at the time, and which would later be seen as a catastrophic misjudgment. Hadrian's response was overwhelming. He recalled Julius Severus from Britain, his best general, and assembled a force that may have included as many as 12 legions or detachments thereof, roughly a third of the entire Roman army. The war was so brutal that Hadrian's report to the Senate, according to the historian Cassius Dio, omitted the traditional opening formula wishing the emperor and the army good health, because things had been so bad that the formula would have been absurd. Roman casualties were severe, but Jewish casualties were catastrophic. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, reported that 580,000 Jews were killed in battle, 50 fortified towns and 985 villages were razed, and countless more died of famine and disease. Modern historians treat these numbers with caution, but the archaeological record confirms widespread destruction across the Judean landscape. The Dead Sea Scrolls cave at Wadi Murabbaat preserved actual letters from Bar Kokhba himself, discovered in the 20th century, giving us a direct documentary window into the final desperate months of the revolt. In one letter, he threatens punishment against men who have failed to provide supplies, the handwriting of command, and beneath it, the tremor of a losing war. Bar Kokhba was killed at the fortress of Bitar in the summer of 135 CE. Rabbi Akiva was executed by the Romans, according to tradition, flayed alive with iron combs. The revolt was over, and now Hadrian made his move. This is the moment, this is the pivot point around which the entire subsequent history of the region turns. Hadrian renamed the province Syria Palaestina. He renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. He banned Jews from entering the city on pain of death, with an exception only on the 9th of Av, when they were permitted to come and weep at the ruins of their temple. He built his new city on the grid of a Roman colonia, with a forum, temples, and a theatre. A statue of Hadrian, or possibly of Jupiter, was placed on the Temple Mount. The name Judea, which derived from Judah, the tribe and the kingdom, was systematically replaced. Palaestina was a name deliberately chosen from antiquity, from a people, the Philistines, who had no living descendants, no political claims, no community that could assert ownership of the name. It was, in the most precise sense, a ghost name. Hadrian was trying to sever the Jewish people's connection to their land, not with a sword, but with a word. Here is a pattern interrupt worth pausing on. The Roman Empire routinely renamed provinces for administrative reasons. Britain was Britannia, Spain was Hispania, Egypt kept its name, but in the case of Judea, the renaming was paired with a population expulsion, a building program designed to overwrite the physical landscape, and a legal prohibition on Jewish residence in the capital city. No other province in Roman history received this combination of treatment simultaneously. Whatever Hadrian's precise motivations, and historians debate whether he was driven primarily by punitive rage, strategic calculation, or a broader Hellenizing cultural agenda, the effect was unique. This was not routine administration, this was something else. And yet the Jewish people did not disappear. This is the central irony, the central drama, the central mystery of what follows. Because in the aftermath of 135 CE, the center of Jewish life shifted north to the Galilee, where the Sanhedrin reconvened under the Patriarch, the Nasi, and Jewish intellectual life not only continued but flourished. Rabbi Judah the Prince, working in the late 2nd and early 3rd century in Beit Sherem and Tipori, compiled and edited the Mishnah, the foundational text of rabbinic Judaism, the written record of the oral Torah that had been transmitted for generations. This was not a small achievement. The Mishnah is a document of extraordinary legal and philosophical sophistication, covering everything from agricultural law to family law to civil procedure to the liturgy of the temple that no longer existed. It was, in a sense, a civilization preserved in amber, a record of a world that had been destroyed, kept alive in text so that it might one day be rebuilt. The diaspora communities that had existed before 70 CE now became the primary context of Jewish life for most Jews in the world. In Alexandria, in Antioch, in Rome itself, in Babylon, where a large Jewish community had existed since the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, Jewish life continued and adapted. The Babylonian community would, over the following centuries, produce the Babylonian Talmud, an even more expansive and authoritative document than the Jerusalem Talmud, completed roughly around the 6th century CE. The irony is profound. Hadrian's attempt to erase Jewish civilization from the land of Israel had the unintended consequence of accelerating the development of a form of Judaism so portable, so intellectually rich, so deeply internalized, that it could survive in any corner of the world. He had tried to kill a tree by cutting it down, and instead he had scattered its seeds across the entire known world. The centuries that followed the Bar Kokhba Revolt saw the Jewish people navigating an increasingly complex political landscape under the Christian Roman Empire of the 4th century, beginning with Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE and accelerating under Theodosius the First, who made Christianity the official religion of the empire in 380 CE. The legal status of Jews deteriorated steadily. Jews were progressively excluded from military service, from holding public office, from owning Christian slaves. The Theodosian Code of 438 CE formalized a range of anti-Jewish legislation. The synagogue, which had become the central institution of Jewish communal life, was legally tolerated but socially marginalized. New synagogues could not be built. Existing ones could not be expanded. The gap between legal tolerance and social reality was wide and dangerous. And yet the synagogues of late antiquity were extraordinary places. Archaeological excavations at sites like Beit Alpha, Hamath Tiberias, and Dura Europos, the last one in Syria, preserved almost miraculously by being buried under a defensive earthwork, have revealed stunning mosaic floors, elaborate frescoes depicting biblical scenes, and architectural sophistication that speaks to communities of considerable wealth and cultural confidence. The Jews of late antiquity were not cowering. They were building, debating, creating, and maintaining a rich internal civilization, even as the external political world grew more hostile. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE introduced another dramatic variable. When the Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered the Byzantine-controlled land of Israel in 636 to 638 CE, Jews in many places initially welcomed them, or at least did not oppose them, because Byzantine Christian rule had been increasingly oppressive. Under early Islamic rule, Jews were classified as dhimmis, protected but subordinate non-Muslim subjects, and required to pay the jizya tax. This was not equality, but it was often better than what had come before. Jewish communities in the newly Islamic world, particularly in Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, experienced a period of relative flourishing. The Geonim, the heads of the great Babylonian academies of Sura and Pombedita, were recognized as the supreme legal authorities for Jewish communities across the Islamic world and beyond. Responsa literature, legal opinions sent by mail in response to questions from distant communities, created a kind of intellectual network that connected Jews from Spain to Persia. The medieval period brought the full weight of European Christian persecution crashing down on Jewish communities in ways that make the Roman period look almost restrained by comparison. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, unleashed waves of massacre against Jewish communities in the Rhineland, Speyer, Worms, Mainz, as crusading armies moving toward Jerusalem decided to begin their holy war against the enemies of Christ closer to home. Thousands were killed. Many communities chose mass suicide rather than forced baptism. The records of these events, preserved in Hebrew chronicles like the Mainz Anonymous, are among the most harrowing documents in Jewish history. What strikes a modern reader is not just the horror, but the specificity, names, dates, individual decisions made under impossible pressure. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 produced a new wave of persecution, as Jews across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. Entire communities were burned alive. In Strasbourg in February 1349, approximately 2,000 Jews were burned on a wooden platform in the Jewish cemetery, before the plague had even reached the city. The accusation was a pretext, and the real motive was debt cancellation and property seizure. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians and therefore could not be responsible, but the bull was largely ignored. The gap between official theology and popular violence was catastrophically wide. Spain, which had been home to one of the most sophisticated Jewish communities in the world. The Sephardim, whose scholars like Maimonides and Judah Halevi had produced philosophy, medicine, poetry, and biblical commentary of enduring brilliance, expelled its entire Jewish population in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west. The Alhambra decree gave Jews 4 months to convert or leave. Approximately 100,000 to 200,000 Jews left Spain, scattering to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II reportedly said that Ferdinand of Spain had impoverished his own kingdom and enriched the Ottoman Empire by sending him such skilled and learned people. The expelled Sephardim carried their language, Ladino, a form of medieval Spanish, their customs, their liturgy, and their grief across the Mediterranean world, where their communities would persist for centuries. The Enlightenment and the era of political emancipation in the 18th and 19th centuries seemed for a moment to offer something genuinely new. The French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789 and the subsequent debates in the French National Assembly about Jewish citizenship, debates that were heated, ugly, and revealing, eventually produced a formal emancipation of French Jews in 1791. Napoleon extended legal equality to Jews across much of Europe as his armies marched east. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and eventually Russia all grappled, at different speeds and with different degrees of sincerity, with the question of Jewish civil rights. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, produced a generation of thinkers who argued that Jews could and should participate fully in European civic life, adopting the languages and customs of their host nations while maintaining their religious identity. Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin was the emblematic figure, a philosopher of European stature who translated the Torah into German and argued that Judaism was a religion of reason compatible with modern life. But emancipation created its own contradictions, its own new dangers. As Jews entered European universities, professions, and political life in the 19th century, a new form of hostility emerged that was different from medieval religious anti-Judaism. This was racial anti-Semitism, the idea, dressed in the pseudo-scientific language of the age, that Jews were not simply people of a different religion who could be converted and absorbed, but a separate and inferior biological race that could never truly belong to European civilization. The word antisemitism itself was coined in 1879 by a German journalist named Wilhelm Marr, who founded the League of Antisemites. The Dreyfus Affair in France in 1894, in which a Jewish army officer was falsely convicted of treason in a trial saturated with anti-Semitic prejudice, shocked European Jews who had believed that emancipation was real and permanent. Theodor Herzl, an assimilated Viennese journalist who covered the Dreyfus trial, watched a Parisian mob chanting "Death to the Jews" and concluded that assimilation was a fantasy. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and in 1897, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. In his diary, he wrote, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it." He was off by 1 year. The State of Israel was declared on May 14, 1948, 51 years after the Basel Congress. The road between Basel and 1948 ran through catastrophes that Herzl could not have imagined even in his darkest moments. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1941 and 1945, was not simply a crime against individuals. It was an attempt to answer the Jewish question through industrial extermination. The specificity of the machinery, the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, where senior Nazi officials coordinated the logistics of genocide over a 90-minute meeting. The network of death camps at Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek, the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units that shot approximately 1.5 million Jews in mass graves across the Soviet Union before the camps were even fully operational. All of it speaks to a level of bureaucratic and ideological commitment to murder that remains almost incomprehensible. And yet it happened. The documents exist. The photographs exist. The testimony of survivors exists. The Nuremberg trials established individual criminal accountability for crimes against humanity in a way that changed international law permanently. The survivors who emerged from the camps, from the forests, from the hiding places, from the exile communities, overwhelmingly did not want to return to the countries that had either participated in their murder or failed to protect them. The pressure of displaced persons in camps in Europe, combined with the political momentum of Zionism, the moral weight of the Holocaust, and the strategic calculations of the great powers, produced the United Nations Partition Plan of November 1947, and then Israel's Declaration of Independence, and then 5 Arab armies invading the next day, and then a war that Israel won at enormous cost, and then the establishment of a state that was, in its deepest historical logic, the answer to everything that Hadrian had tried to do in 135 CE. Hadrian had renamed a province to sever a people from their land. He had built a Roman city on Jerusalem's ruins to overwrite the memory of what had been there. He had banned Jews from their holy city, imposed humiliating taxes, and done everything a pre-modern empire could do to make a people forget who they were and where they came from. And what he got, 18 centuries later, was a state whose founding document explicitly invoked the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel as an unbroken historical and spiritual reality. The name he chose, Palestina, had taken on a life of its own, had become the name by which the region was known to the world, had become the basis for competing national narratives of extraordinary complexity and pain. But the people he had tried to erase were still there, still arguing, still building, still studying the texts that had been compiled in the shadow of his destruction. There is something almost vertiginous about the long arc of this history. A single emperor's administrative decision, the renaming of a province, became one of the most consequential acts of political symbolism in human history, shaping the language of conflict over a piece of land for 2,000 years. The Jewish people, scattered across the world by Roman force, developed in exile a form of civilization so durable that it outlasted the Roman Empire itself, outlasted the Byzantine Empire, outlasted the Crusader kingdoms, outlasted the Ottoman Empire, and outlasted the Third Reich. Every attempt to solve the problem of Jewish existence by erasing Jewish existence produced instead a deepening and a strengthening of Jewish identity, a more urgent and more sophisticated engagement with the question of what it means to be a people without a state, and then, eventually, the political will to have one. The renaming of Judea as Palestine was not the end of the Jewish story. It was, in a sense, the beginning of the next chapter, the longest, strangest, most improbable chapter of survival in recorded history. And that is the thing about trying to erase a people with a word. Words can be changed, names can be reclaimed, but the people who carry a civilization inside them, in their texts and their prayers and their arguments and their grief, those people are considerably harder to rename than a province on a map.